This video is brought to you by mybookie.ag. We have finally arrived to UFC 281 on Saturday, headlined by Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira and Carla Esparza versus Zhang Weili. The card is really good, a lot of action-packed talent all over it, from the early prelims all the way to the main event. I mean, we're starting the card with Carlos Ulberg, which is very similar to how all these cards start, with Adesanya having one of his teammates starting the early prelims. We also have a surprising return with Zaitar coming back after a few years, and he's making his way into a fight with Matt Frevola, which is going to be an insane fight. Two guys that really don't back down, two guys that sometimes will throw caution to the wind. It should be a very entertaining fight. Erin Blanchfield is a very good test for Molly McCann to move forward to see exactly where she stands in the rankings of the flyweight division. Return of Dominic Reyes. This is a guy that hasn't fought in a bit, not doing too well in his career, and he's going up against another dangerous fighter in Ryan Spann, who has a lot of power and a lot of submission wins. Brad Riddell versus Renato Moicano was a very good fight, and we have the return of Dan Hooker coming back up to the 155-pound division, going up against a much younger Claudio Puelles, and I can only tell they're making this fight to see if the younger guy can build himself off of Dan Hooker's name, knowing that Hooker is not doing too well in his career right now. Hooker is 32 years old, but he's taken a lot of damage and he's not performing the same, especially when he went down the featherweight. We'll see how he looks on his way back up to 155. And speaking of fighters that seem to be on the decline, Frankie Edgar is fighting Chris Gutierrez. This is Frankie's retirement fight regardless of how it goes down. He is calling it after this fight, and it's in New York, close to his home. This is the best way for Frankie to have that farewell fight, but I wish it was against someone who was older and not necessarily a younger fighter who's probably going to hurt him. Chris Gutierrez is a dangerous fighter and doing very well on this hot momentum. And of course, we have the three featured fights that we'll get into later in the video. Poirier versus Chandler, Esparza versus Weili, and Adesanya versus Pereira. But the prospect of the night, even though there are a few of them out here, I was originally thinking it was going to be Claudio Puelles, but I'm going to go with Carlos Ulberg. Carlos Ulberg is looking really good. A lot of people started to doubt him after a couple of his performances, but in this last fight, he looked like a monster out there, very technical, extremely athletic, and going for the finish. Ulberg isn't necessarily young, but he's young in the game. And in this light heavyweight division, there is a lot of time for him to get better to the point where he could do something special in the future. The fighter of the night is definitely Israel Adesanya. He's the marquee fighter of the card, the guy everybody's gonna be looking at. If he beats Alex Pereira, it does huge for his legacy, not only just for MMA, but combat sports in general, to get that revenge back. This is more than just a championship fight for both Adesanya and Pereira. The banger of the night, the most explosive fight on the card. There is three of them. It was really hard to pick one, but I'm ultimately going to go with Matt Frevola versus Zaitar. I'm super looking forward to this fight. Zaitar always comes out there to take your head off with every single punch. He does not pull in his punches. He does not trick you on his intentions. Frevola is a lot craftier, and we'll see what he can do to evade some of that aggression or meet it head on and overpower it himself. Frevola has different ways of how he'll approach a fight. The fight of the night. I could not look past Dustin Poirier versus Michael Chandler. This fight has almost everything you want in a fight. Technique, skill, the ability to adapt inside of a fight, the experience on both fighters' sides to make these different kind of adjustments and decisions that you're not going to see from most of the other fighters on the card. You have all the skills in the grappling, you have all the skills in the striking. This fight has everything you want. And finally, the stake of the night, the fighter that's in hot waters, is Dominic Reyes. Dominic Reyes is on a 3-loss streak, 2 of those devastating knockout losses. And if he loses another one to Ryan Spann, it's most likely going to be by a finish. It could spell the end of Reyes as a real contender for the title moving forward. And it really throws a question into his whole performance against John Jones. I know it probably shouldn't, but that's probably what's going to happen. And he'll only be known as the guy that got close to beating Jones and then couldn't really do anything else after. I'm not going to say Frankie Edgar because he's going to retire regardless, so he's not really in hot waters. So the first fight we're going to start with is Dan Hooker versus Claudio Puelles. This is an interesting one with an X Factor thrown on top of it. Dan Hooker's coming back from 145, and he looked very slow there. Did not look like himself at all. Cut way too much weight and got absolutely ran through by Arnold Allen, a guy who was not really known to knock out his opponents. And he finished Dan Hooker in the very first round. Hooker looked like he was fighting underwater. And I don't expect to see the same kind of thing at 155, but it's his return fight back. So are those effects of him cutting all that weight going to stay with him? Sometimes it does. Look at Roy Jones Jr. And just by itself, this is a stylistically tough fight for him. Claudio Puelles is a grappler for the most part. Definitely if it goes to the ground, Hooker's going to be in a lot of trouble. Claudio's excellent with his knee bars. He goes for your legs. He goes for the arm bars, everything at a very quick pace. He does not slow down with his executions on his submissions. If you expose anything, he's going for it. And Dan Hooker has very long arms and legs, and I can absolutely see a scenario where Puelles is able to either pull guard, take Hooker to the ground, get in a bit of a scramble, and then start attacking those long limbs. On the feet, though, Dan Hooker should have the advantage. at least on paper. Puelles is not necessarily like a polished striker. He's a southpaw kicker for the most part, will sometimes throw the left straight, but the guy is 26 years old. He's getting much, much better at the full aspect of MMA and probably spending most of his time on his striking. So if Dan Hooker comes out there and not his same self, I wouldn't even be too surprised if Puelles starts to put hands on him, kick him to the body, kick him to the legs, and try to take him to the ground off of his own strikes, and then just steamrolls him. I can absolutely see a scenario where that happens. And it's interesting because on the odds, Dan Hooker is the favorite. I would have to say right now, Puelles might be your underdog of the whole card. So ultimately, my prediction for this fight, I am going to go with Claudio Puelles. I think youth is on his side. I think the grappling skill is on his side. He's much, much faster than Hooker in every aspect of the game. And Dan Hooker has a very bad habit of keeping his legs very far out there, which makes it much easier for Puelles to shoot in on a single leg and make something happen. Hooker also doesn't have the greatest striking defense. So I'm going to go Claudio Puelles. I'm going to go by a second round submission. I could possibly even see first round. And then we go to the best fight on the whole card. Dustin Poirier versus Michael Chandler. Man, I cannot wait for this one. Right off the bat, you could see how much of a favorite Poirier is. A lot of people don't have that much faith in Michael Chandler's explosiveness because that's ultimately the way he would probably win the fight unless he wrestles. If he comes out there and starts wrestling, things get very interesting because I don't know if Poirier can stop the early takedowns. And not only that, Chandler can grapple with the best of them. His Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for MMA is very much top notch. And at any moment, you know that he can knock out anybody in the world. And Poirier doesn't do as well in the striking against orthodox fighters as he does against southpaws because a big defense to him is that Philly shell and his ability to pull away from some of those shots. The Philly shell isn't necessarily going to work too well against an opposite stance fighter like Michael Chandler, where if he tries a shoulder roll, Chandler could condition him to hit him with a right hand to the face. Chandler does that very often where he'll fake to the body to start standing up to your head. And the way that Dustin would probably have to defend the body shot is actually by rotating his body clockwise and using his elbow to block or parry the punch. If he starts doing that and Chandler throws a right hand to the head, there Chandler could potentially find his punch getting through the guard as Poirier is squaring his stance to his punch. It's a very simple strategy from Chandler that he does against everybody, so potentially Poirier could even game plan against it very easily, but if it does happen, it's something that can definitely work in Chandler's favor. And if Poirier starts to lean away from the punches, there are opportunities for Chandler to fake up high, not only fake into the body, but he fakes up to the head as well, just to get Poirier to lean away. And him leaning away from the punches up top is going to expose his hips. There is a powerful blast double leg from Michael Chandler. And also the fight is 3 rounds, which is heavily going to favor Michael Chandler's chances. But there's many more ways that Dustin Poirier is going to win, and actually I would have to say the most likely way this fight ends is actually in Poirier's favor. The counter shots against those overextending right hands. Whenever Chandler commits, it's a big overextension on that punch, and Dustin is probably the last guy you want to overextend on. He is potentially the best boxer in the whole lightweight division for a reason. His counter shots are on point, his jab is on point. He can absolutely find Chandler's chin with almost any single punch he wants to throw if he's able to evade Chandler's right hand. So actually everything about Chandler has to be pinpoint accurate. If he misses, the fight could be over for him. It could start to be the beginning of the end because when Poirier starts to crack your chin, he doesn't let up and he's not reckless in those exchanges. He's very aware of what he's doing and stays technical. Not only that, once he starts to get the pressure on Chandler, the output can potentially be way too overwhelming for Chandler to find his shot through it. And you could see a very similar thing that happened to him in previous fights where he kind of gets lost inside of the barrage. He doesn't know when to fight, he doesn't know when to defend, and he gets caught up in the mix. And there's a high probability that happens to him in this fight as well. So ultimately, my prediction for this fight, it's a tough one. I definitely don't see it the way the odds see it, but I do favor the guy they're favoring as well. I am going to go with Dustin Poirier. Very slightly though. This fight can end in very different ways, but I ultimately do see Dustin Poirier winning this by a 3rd round TKO. And then we go to the co-main event. Carla Esparza defends her title against Zhang Weili, and man, does it seem like Weili is going to steamroll Esparza. It's very simple to understand of the most likely way this fight unfolds. Zhang Weili stops the takedowns. She's too strong, too good of hips. She's been wrestling with Henry Cejudo. She has advanced in that skill set so far that maybe even Esparza cannot even get her to the ground. Esparza's a bit smaller as well. And if it's forced standing, Weili just tears her apart in any way she wants. It could be very reminiscent to the way Joanna beat Carla, except with someone who has more power. And that's super worrisome. The only thing that changes any trajectory of this fight is if Carla is able to get her down early. Later in the rounds, it's more likely to happen for Carla, but early, if it happens, if she gets Zhang Weili down, everything changes about the fight. Everything. The whole notion that Zhang Weili could probably find her chin, be too strong, be too physical, and all this stuff gets thrown out the window. And now what does she have to rely on? Her grappling skill. Is it enough for her to get up from the bottom, to defend against the ground and pound, to out-scramble Carla? I don't think so necessarily. It would be very surprising, and it would show her progression in her wrestling if she out-scrambles Carla on the ground. That would be the most impressive thing of the whole fight. But ultimately, I am going to go with Zhang Weili, and I'm actually going to go by a decision win. I think Carla is tough enough to endure the whole 3 rounds. And then we go to the main event. The fight everybody's waiting for, Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. Out of every single fight on the whole card, this one is the hardest to predict because number 1, Pereira hasn't been doing this too long. Number 2, they have fought each other before. So there is a different kind of mental aspect in this fight because when they fought each other, it was under kickboxing rules many years ago. So how exactly are they going to show up against each other? With the familiarity that they have about each other. There's absolutely going to be things in this fight from both of them that they haven't done before in an MMA fight. Simply because they know stuff about each other that nobody else does. But honestly, it's all going to come down to how does Adesanya approach it. We pretty much know how Alex Pereira is going to fight this one. Just how he fights everybody else. Patient on the outside, hands low, squared stance at times, but it allows him to generate a lot of power into his hooks and also makes his kicks a lot more seamless. They're much more subtle than the way Adesanya throws his kicks. Because Adesanya has that bladed stance very sideways, his kicks are already cocked back and rotated. So there's a lot more power from the stance that Adesanya throws his kicks than where Pereira throws. But Pereira has that natural power where it doesn't even matter how he stands. He's going to hurt you regardless, right? So with the speed of Pereira's kicks, how they come out of nowhere, there's going to be a lot of those landing to the leg of Adesanya, I can only imagine. As Adesanya keeps that long stance, the leg is there to be kicked. And for sure, Pereira's going to be looking for that left hook. 100%. And it's not only because he landed it before, but it's because of the way that Adesanya's style has changed in MMA. More so than Pereira's has changed. Adesanya having that bladed stance and he turns and posts away from everything. What is the potential shot to get through? Especially if Adesanya is orthodox. The left hook. There's the biggest window for that punch to land if Adesanya is on the defense. Now, if Adesanya is on the offense, things get mixed up a bit more. And actually, I could definitely see where Adesanya will have more success being offensive in this fight than defensive. Because if he sticks behind the reach, posts, and moves, for the first time, he's going up against a guy who's as long and as tall as he is. Also, I just found out, he's 30 pounds heavier. Pereira is a monstrous middleweight. This guy is giant, and it's not even confusing anymore as to why he looks so much thinner on the scales. The guy walks around at 232 pounds, whereas Adesanya walks around at about 200 to 203. And sometimes the biggest thing in a fight is to get the bigger man or the more powerful man to move backwards, as it takes power away from their punch, as well as it makes them a much easier target to hit at times, especially off of the orthodox jab, landing right hands to the body kicks, a lot of teeps to the body, knowing that Pereira likes to keep that squared stance at times, and as many stuff coming from the center line from Adesanya that could potentially just keep getting Pereira to move backwards toward the cage. And there Adesanya can stalk him enough to win on rounds. Adesanya's methods should not be to try to get the knockout necessarily. It would be to try to win this on the scorecards, but make it meaningful because he's going up against a guy who's going to be looking to knock him out eventually. So ultimately, my prediction for this fight, it's tough. It's back and forth. No matter what way I slice it, it's near a pick'em for me. And it's always been that way. You know what though? I'm going to go with the interesting pick because it is so close. I'm going to go with Alex Pereira. I'm going to go with the underdog here. And the way he would win would probably be by a mid-round knockout. So like midway throughout the second toward the early 4th round, anywhere in that time, I can see him finding Adesanya's chin, potentially with the left hook or a right straight. I can absolutely see where Adesanya even knocks Pereira out. I can absolutely see that scenario happening. The experience in MMA that Adesanya has is a big one. It's a big key factor going into this, but also is knowing the fact that you beat this guy twice already, so they both have a mental edge going into this. In a different way though. Who has the bigger mental edge? You would probably have to think it's Pereira, especially with the way that Adesanya has been talking about Pereira for years. But yeah, ultimately I am going to go with Alex Pereira, and I'm going to go by around a 3rd round knockout. So as you can see, there's a lot of really interesting odds in this one. You have to go to mybookie.ag to capitalize on this because the odds are moving, the lines are moving right now, and it's the best time to get on them. If you're someone who's going to look to bet on Alex Pereira, he is growing as an underdog, actually. More people are putting money on Adesanya, so if you think Pereira, who beat him twice in kickboxing, looks really good at MMA right now, if he has the ingredients to defeat the champion, right now is the best time to capitalize on him. And anybody who wants to bet on Adesanya, get on him before he becomes too big of a favorite. You're not going to get the same kind of return. If you're looking for the big upset of the card, the champion is a plus 300, which is enormous. I don't think she's going to win, but crazy stuff has happened before. Carla has often been an underdog in her fights, and oftentimes she wins those. And 2 of the fights that I disagree with the most are the Dustin Poirier versus Michael Chandler odds, as well as the Dan Hooker versus Claudio Puelles odds. I do think Dustin should win, but definitely not as big of a favorite as he is. Chandler's way too dangerous for anybody to steamroll him in that way. And there are clashes in this stylistically that can help Chandler, as well as it being 3 rounds. So even if he starts getting hurt later in the fight, if he can wrap up the first 2, the odds are really good in his favor. And then of course, I do think Claudio Puelles should be the favorite going into the Dan Hooker fight. So in my opinion, that is your dog of the card. So when you go to mybookie.ag and you capitalize on these odds, make sure to get the deposit bonus where MyBookie will match up your first deposit all the way up to $1,000. It's a great deal, and to activate it, you want to use the promo code WEASEL. That's WEASLE when you sign up. They'll ask you for the promo code. Put that one in and you get the free deposit bonus. Just make sure to go to mybookie.ag today. And that is the end of the predictions, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to give this video a like and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I'll see you guys in the next video.